Hello. Today I'm here at a section of the old London Wall. 10,000 years ago, Mongols were crossing the English Channel via an Ice Age land bridge, so the king said, "Hey, we gotta build a wall to keep these Mongols out." And his chief architect said, "Wonderful idea, sir. It's genius. I like how racist it is." And the king said, "No, it's not." So for the past 10,000 years, this wall has defended England from the Mongols. And suddenly it doesn't seem like so long since I last uploaded a video, huh? So, what are we doing today? I'm gonna try to make kind of a physics-based remote control spaceship where you can kind of sit in the cockpit and use the controls to actually like turn on certain thrusters, and so we can just animate the whole thing like in real time. Actually, the very first project I ever did in Blender when I moved over to it from Bryce 3D. Do you guys remember Bryce 3D? Were you guys born when Bryce 3D was out? No, back in like 2003, the neighbor kid, Andy Rhodes, was like, you know, showing me Blender. And the thing that actually got me into it was the fact you could do an IK rig. Where, you know, you could move the hips around, but the leg would solve and keep the foot planted, which is really relevant to me because I had seen Wild Wild West with the big robot tarantula, and that was the thing I wanted to do most in all of the entire world. Yeah, the very first thing I modeled in Blender was a big robot spider. But the second thing was trying to use the Blender game engine to, simulate spaceship physics, because back then Blender had a built-in game engine and you could literally set it up to, you know, WASD control kind of different things. It turns out for most of the type of animation I was trying to do, which is spaceships swooping along specific paths through buildings and everything, it was a lot easier to just like set up a curve and parent an object to it than actually try to simulate everything. But here we are 20-something years later, and I'm kind of thinking I want to try to simulate a spaceship again, because if you saw my post last week or 2 weeks ago, I'm talking about how I'm building, you know, we're building this 2-story kind of spaceship set in the church, and what I really want to do is have, and it's supposed to be kind of a tugboat type thing, really heavy and bulky, and I want to be able to feel the inertia and the different forces acting on it. And I'm a decent kind of technical animator. Like, I understand, you know, inertia and equal opposite reaction and all that to a degree. If something doesn't look right, I can usually identify it and just keep changing things until it isn't distractingly bad. But like, in the same way that nobody can hold a candle to a really good animator, it's hard to hold a candle to a proper physics simulation. So let's see if we can just like dive into that. This is Blender. Hopefully that's not too surprising. And this is kind of a sequel to a video I did last year talking about rigid body physics, or maybe I did a couple of videos. But we did one where you were controlling a tank in real time, and it had, you know, the barrel and all the different modules were all kind of like shaking a little bit, and all that stuff that's like really hard to hand animate, but can add a ton of realism to a final kind of render. So if you want to see any of this stuff slightly more in detail, go watch that video. I'm gonna try to cover, you know, all the basics real fast here, but yeah, we don't get quite as granular. So let's start with rigid bodies. Rigid bodies are a type of physics system, you know, built into Blender. There's also, you know, like cloth sim and fluid sim and all of that, but rigid bodies in particular are useful for simulating like hard rigid objects. Here, let's turn off the floor here. And there's 2 types of rigid bodies. Let's create a floor. And if we go down to the physics panel, which is where most of the rigid body settings are, you can see we've got this button. I'm going to click it, and we've got 2 options. There's active and passive for the type. Both of them interact with the simulation, but active will actually move, whereas passive is just kind of like something that stays, you know, still, like the ground or a wall. And so we want the ground to be passive, and we want the cube to be active. And if we hit play, the cube falls to the ground, and that's exactly perfect. And that's kind of as far as I got with rigid body physics for, you know, 15 years or whatever. Or I would, like, you know, you set up a pile of rigid body cubes, and then you have like a spaceship or a car fly through them, and it's like, yeah, I was basically just only doing stuff with cubes. And I knew that it was possible to like use constraints to set up relationships between the objects, but you had to create an empty and turn the empty into a constraint and have that constraint target 2 different objects and then define what the constraint actually was. And I was like, that's just a lot of different steps to have 2 cubes kind of wobble around each other and then, you know, half the time crash Blender. And I'm re-recording this bit because I made it sound complicated, and it's actually not complicated. So we've got these 2 active cubes here. I'm going to create an empty, which will hold our constraint. Let's do a sphere, I guess. I'm going to stick it kind of in between these. And under the physics tab, you can see we can now create a rigid body constraint out of this empty. And by default, it's set to fixed, which is just kind of like the parenting version of the rigid body world. It just means it's going to try to keep them both in the same relative position. We just have to select the objects. So here we'll do one, and then we'll do the other. And if we hit play here, it's treating it like it's the same object. But we've got all these other types of constraints. One I really like is point, which just kind of keeps it orbiting around the point of the constraint. Let's see, if we change this one to passive, you can see it a little bit better. You can see it's orbiting around the constraint. By default, a lot of constraints have disable collision checked. If we uncheck that, this one will swing until it hits that other one. And you'll notice it's actually orbiting around the constraint itself. If we put the constraint here inside this cube, we now have one cube that kind of rotates around the other one. And if we raise the ground, it'll swing until it hits the ground like that. Kind of cool. But again, kind of a lot of work just to have one cube swing around the other cube. So here, let's change this one back to active. Let's set up a bunch of different cubes all in a row here, because we can do this a lot easier. I'm going to select all of these, and I'm going to select the first cube last so it's active. And if I hit F3, we can add our constraints via this menu too. I'm just going to say connect, and we get object rigid body connect. And it's already set up a bunch of empties, and it gives us this little panel down here that lets us control everything. So we can set up all these constraints at once. By default, it's set to fixed. Let's change it to point. And for the location, that's saying the location of the constraint empties, let's put it to selected. Well, we could do active first, which means all the constraints are centered in the first object here. Let's move this like that. And just for demonstration purposes, let's set this back to passive here. And you can see every cube is now swinging, on its constraint around the original cube. But the really cool thing, if we undo all of this, F3 connect, this last one here, connection pattern, selected to active, we can change this to chain by distance, and it'll actually look and see that these are all kind of in a row and set up all the constraints accordingly. So now, here, let's pull this over. And it kind of animates as if it's a long rope. They're all just connected to each other, and that's very cool. Let's delete all of this and model a spaceship. I'm going to create a cube. Because it's physics, you kind of want to keep everything at scale. And what do I mean by at scale? Effectively, I just mean that here in the side panel, all the values under scale are set to 1. Because we're in a computer, we can do some kind of funky stuff. The Blender default cube is 2 meters per side here, but as you probably know, if you hit S, you can scale this up to whatever you want. But you notice when we do that, we're changing this scale value. And the weird thing is, this is still a 2 meter cube. It's just a 2 meter cube with a scale modifier of like 3.279 on each dimension, resulting in the final dimensions. You can think of it of like if you were 5 feet tall and then a wizard came and was like, cast a size doubling spell on you. Like you're still a 5-foot guy, but then forget about the wizard. And in general, if you're rendering a city or something, it doesn't matter. If, it's like secretly that building is a small building, that's the wizard got it. But the physics system hates that. If you're like, here, I want you to simulate this 2 meter cube as if it's a 10 meter cube, and it's like, why? It's going to be weird. So the way we fix that is we just hit Control A and we apply the scale. And you'll see all of these scale values here are set to 1, but it maintains its dimensions. So that's just the thing I do all the time when I'm doing physics, is make sure I'm hitting Control A, applying the scale so everything is actually the size that it actually is. Anyways, the dimensions of the spaceship I think should be something like 4 meters wide, 7 meters long, and 4 meters tall, kind of like a stick of butter. And what I want to do is I want to add forces on this that push it around in zero gravity that you can turn off and on. I recorded this entire video a couple weeks ago using a completely different method because, look at this, under the scene settings here, I'm going to uncheck gravity, which means if we hit play, nothing happens because no forces are being acted on the cube at all. But if we hit Shift A, we can add a force field here, and if we move that behind the cube and actually, let's parent it to the cube here with Control P. And under the physics settings, we're going to turn up the strength. And under the maximum distance, I'm going to raise it a little bit. And if we hit play, nothing happens because we haven't made it a rigid body yet. All right, there we go. And if we hit play, you can see the force field pushes the cube. And so I was like, okay, that's great. I actually did it. Here, I'll show you. I said this whole crazy thing so that this empty would, control. It's still pretty janky, but like, here we can fly forwards. And this was more or less what I was looking for. until suddenly I tried to add another object. I thought, oh, wouldn't it be cool if like there was a cube it could crash into, like a big meteor or something. F3, add active, and when I hit play, nothing happened. And I tried literally everything. And then I started Googling it, and all Google would say is you can't use force fields on a rigid body object. But obviously you kind of can. So I was apparently exploiting this weird edge case and blunder of the overlap of the different physics systems where they didn't specifically make it so it wouldn't work, but if you're actually trying to use it for anything practical, at some point the physics system just gives up. So I was pulling my hair out until... Actually, let's explain kind of why, and you can skip this bit if you want, but let's explain why you can't just mix physics systems. And it has to do with the dependency graph inside of Blender. Like, computers really like a specific, like an order of operations. They want to do one thing and then the next thing and the next thing. And when you do physics, everything is affecting everything else. Like if you have a cube that's falling into a net, the cube is deforming the net, but the net is also hindering the cube, and so you have to calculate both of those things at the same time, which is hard when those two things are calculated by different physics systems. So in this case, let's say we have an empty here. This is the force, it's parented to this cube, so ideally it would go this way. And let's say this is the order of operations that Blender calculates everything in, where parenting transforms is just, you know, you move one object, every object parented to it also moves along with it. And let's say on this given frame, the ship is rotating a little bit. The first thing it calculates is the rigid body rotation, so it goes, oh, okay, here we go. And then it calculates the force from the thruster, which should ideally be right behind it, but now it's kind of down below it. And then it calculates the parenting transform, so this catches up. But it's too late. It already applied this diagonal force, which means on the next frame, this is spinning even faster. This is even more left behind and even more of kind of an obscure angle, so it's even more offset. Then this catches up, which means now it's spinning even faster, and now it's, you know, which means once things cross a certain threshold, they just start spinning and absolutely going crazy. And the dependency graph is kind of this ongoing nightmare, I think, in development. I don't think there's a right answer, really. Back when I worked at the Blender Institute back in 2012, there were all these features that I kept pestering them about, and they were like, oh yeah, we'll be able to do that as soon as we figure out the dependency graph. And now it's 12 years later, and you still can't offset the timing of instances of groups or collections, which makes me believe they're still working on it. Anyways, let's get back to our ship. So I was basically giving up, except I sent a random message to Austin of AKA Studios. He's the guy who made the RBC car driving add-on that where you can actually use like the Xbox controller. I used it a bunch on the latest Dynamo episode. I absolutely love it, and I was like, if anybody knows, he would. Because the problem I was running into is I needed a force, but I couldn't think of any rigid body object or constraint that provided a force. They would all just, you know, hinge or pivot or pistons or kind of something like that. And I needed something that provided an inertia. But it turns out, in Austin, again, thank you so much, that there is one rigid body constraint that will just provide a force, and that is the motor constraint. Let's set this up. I'm going to create a ground plane right now. And that's actually what threw me, because I knew that constraints controlled the relationships between two rigid body objects. So even if the motor was providing thrust, I assumed that it would always be away from the origin of the plane, like wherever it was. And that just didn't seem very, very useful to me. My very first attempt at trying to figure this out physics-wise was just to have a global wind that would just push the object, you know, north, south, east, or west, and I tried to have drag that would kind of like make the ship align with the wind, and it was incredibly awkward, and it didn't work at all. And I didn't want it to be globally based coordinates. I wanted all the physics to be coming from the ship itself. So no matter what direction you're at, if the ship was upside down and you said go to the right, it would go to the ship's right, if that makes sense. So here, let's create an empty, and that's going to become the constraint. I'm going to use arrows because that lets us see the different axes here. Different constraints kind of operate on different axes. Like if you have the hinge constraint, I think that rotates around the x-axis also, which kind of just serves as like, that's the axle that things are mounted to. In this case, the thrust is going to be coming out of the x, so I'm going to scale this down and just scale out the x-axis so we can easily see where it's going. In fact, let's rotate it so it's sticking right out of the back of the cube here. And I'm going to parent it to the cube. And if I select this and go into the physics tab, I can say rigid body constraint. We're going to change it to motor. And all I care about is linear. You can see it gives us two options here. There's target velocity, which is the maximum amount of thrust it'll give, and there's impulse, which is just the amount of torque, effectively. Like how much push is it going to give to get it up to that maximum velocity. In this case, since we're in like, space is a void, I wanted to keep going faster and faster forever if it wants to, and we can dial in this maximum impulse, which is the thrust power later. But down below, this is what kind of threw me, because you can select a cube and you can select a plane, but I didn't really care what this plane was doing. Turns out, just don't worry about it. The plane just represents space. It represents the transformed space that things push against. Whatever you select as this first object is going to be the coordinate space that it's actually thrusting against, which is a complicated way of saying, here, let's save and hit go. Nothing happens, and that's because I never turned the plane into a rigid body object. So here, let's make that passive, and now let's try it. And look at that. Okay, it's providing thrust out along the x-axis. And here, look at this. If we rotate it to be at like a different angle or something, it's just using the direction. This is exactly what I wanted. It doesn't care about the plane at all. In fact, we can hide this plane. I'm going to, under the object settings, visibility, let's just make it be, or a viewport display. We'll just see the wireframe of it. Yeah, there we go. Which means we just have thrust now in our like, if we put it offset, and here let's flip it that way, it's going to push right here, which is going to make it kind of like rotate around like this. It's all just operating exactly how I wanted it to. But let's put this back in the center, face it forwards, and this will be our overall thrust. And first thing I want to do is dial in the mass of the ship itself. If we go under the physics tab, you can see right now it's 1 kilogram. I'm going to change that to 20, which is still really light. The thing is, if you make everything actually appropriately weighted, you got to crank all the physics numbers to be absolute, like 2 million or whatever. So I'm just going to keep things a little bit lightweight, and as long as everything's kind of proportionally ratioed down lightweight, I'm going to hope it kind of works. And if we hit play here, I'm just going to turn up the impulse until it seems something kind of fun. Yeah, 70 looks like that's a good acceleration speed, and that's just a number I'm going to hold in the back of my head. 70 is a good number for this. But we're not going to put 70 right into there. What I want is one collected place where all the ship controls are kind of centralized so we can easily change whatever we want. And to do that, we're going to dive into properties, which I don't think I've ever really used in Plunder ever, which is kind of ridiculous. Like, I see it all the time. If we select this cube, go under the object settings and scroll to the bottom, you can see we've got this custom properties panel, and I've always seen it there, but I didn't really know what it did. Here, if we click new, we've added a new property. In fact, in the side panel here, we've got this new pop-up properties that has that same thing, and I was like, cool, okay, now we have a property with a value of 1. What is that? Well, that's literally just a number now that the object is holding. When you select this cube now knows that it has a property with a value of 1, which doesn't do anything. But we'll get to that later. First, let's adjust this property. You can see we've got this gear right here. I'm going to name this thrust, and it gives us these other options here. So there's minimum and maximum, which is the absolute minimum and maximum, and then there's the soft minimum and max. Have you ever noticed when you're kind of scrolling in a slider in Blender, sometimes the number will stop at like 10, but if you want to, you can click on it and type in, 1,000 or whatever, and it'll like explode. That's what the soft minimum and maximum is. So let's set up the soft to be like 0 and, yeah, we'll just say and 1. But the actual minimum and maximum can be here. Let's make it 1,000, 10,000. Who cares? Be sure to hit OK. Most panels, if you hit Enter, it saves everything. In this one, if you just hit Enter, it forgets everything you did. But look at that. Now the cube has a property of thrust with a value set to 1. One thing that's kind of cool about Blender, if you hover over an input field and hit backspace, it resets the default to whatever it should be. I want the default to be 0, which means, okay, yeah, we'll change this to 0. Okay, and now if we hover this and hit backspace, it zeroes out. So obviously what we want to do is come up with a way so that this thrust value somehow affects the impulse of the constraint. And we can do that very easily using drivers, which again, we talked about last year. I just think they're really fun. And there's a hard way, which we'll start with first, because I think it's a good thing to know. And then there's an easy way, which we'll do immediately after. Here, let's create a cube here. And I'm sure you already know this, but here in the side panel, this just refers to the X, Y, and Z coordinates that the cube is in 3D space. And if you move it over here, you know those numbers update. If you hit Alt-R, that just zeroes out all of the rotation values, and Alt-G zeroes out all the translation values. So let's have this on the Y-axis. I'm going to duplicate it and add another one. And what I want to do is when I move this box left to right, I want this cube to go up and down on the Z-axis. You can see right here, that's the number that's changing. So I'm going to right-click on that value, and I'm going to add a driver. And this panel right here is the whole reason that I spent, 15 years not learning drivers, because it looks really complicated. It isn't. It's just, it wants an expression, which is just a little equation, and it wants a variable. And look, there's even an eyedropper. So the variable is going to be, and we select the object we want to provide the variable here. We're going to go back in, right-click, edit the driver, and we get to pick which data it's using. In this case, the default is the location on the x-axis. So whatever value this cube has on the x-axis becomes variable, and we can name this literally whatever we want. Whatever we want. And it says, whoa, that doesn't make any sense. And that's because the expression is looking for variable, but we don't care about any of this. Literally, all we want the expression to be is whatever we want. And suddenly it's happy, and literally all it's doing, this expression is just saying, hey, the output is wherever that other cube is on the x-axis. So if we select this cube and move it back and forth, you can see the other cube goes up and down, the corresponding amount. If we set this one to 11 meters to the right, this one is 11 meters up. So that's the hard way, which honestly I started with because I didn't know the easy way existed until a couple minutes ago. So I'm very excited because take a look at this. We can literally just hover over this property right here, copy as new driver, click on the other object, and we'll paste that into the field we want here, paste driver. So now when we move this back and forth on the x-axis, the other one goes up and down. It's that easy, and we can still go in here and edit the driver and do whatever we want, except instead of being a scripted expression, by default it's just the value, but we can change that back to an expression, and we can still multiply that variable by, let's say 2. So then this will just do twice of whatever it does on the other. How cool is that? But I'm recording this after the fact, so unfortunately we're going to be doing it the hard way for the rest of the video, which is good. It builds character. So, with that in mind, how do we get this data into the driver? I'm going to right-click on this and copy data path, just because that's going to make my life a little bit easier. Then we're going to go into the constraint, and under max impulse, we're going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to right-click and add driver. And instead of, by default, it's a transform channel, like XYZ rotation or whatever, we're going to change it to property. And the property is going to come from the spaceship here. In fact, let's select this cube right now. You can see up here it's just called cube. I'm going to hit F2 and call it spaceship. Great. We're going to go back into our driver settings here. You can see this is updated to be spaceship. And the path, I'm just going to paste in that data path I already got. And so for this driver, we've just created a variable that's just whatever the value of thrust is. In fact, let's call the variable thrust 2. It's weird that we have we have to turn a property into a variable. I get that, but just, you get used to it. And for the expression, let's delete all of this nonsense, and we can just say thrust, and everything is happy. And again, well, I think that's good to know. The easy way, if we go into this object's properties, just copies new driver, go into the constraint, and paste that into the impulse as a driver. And now if we hit play and turn thrust up to 1, it's moving very, very slowly, even though this is completely maxed out. And that's because, do you remember when we found out that 70 was a good kind of resting point for the impulse? We can transform this 1 into 70 really easily. Just right click, edit driver, and now the expression is thrust times 70. Great. So if we hit play and crank this to 1, suddenly it's going to accelerate 70 times faster. That's absolutely fantastic. And what's cool is we can do this to basically any property. Do you remember gravity over here that we turned off? Well, if you look here, gravity is just a force pushing everything down at 9.8 meters per second squared. And it'd be kind of cool in kind of a spaceship taking off type dynamic to be able to turn gravity off and on from kind of inside the spaceship. So let's go back under object settings here. I'm going to add a new property. I'm going to click edit. We'll call it gravity. Value goes from 0 to 1. I think that's totally fine. Let's have the default value be 0, so gravity is off. If we go back under our scene settings, we can right click on this, add driver, We'll change the variable type to property like we did before. We'll say it's from the spaceship. And the path, again, you can copy and paste the data path like we did before, but it's really easy. It's open bracket, quote, gravity, and make sure you match the capitalization and everything. And then just, close the quotes and the bracket. And look at that, it's happy. And we'll call this gravity. Gravity. And for our expression, I just will multiply whatever this value is times gravity, which means when gravity is set to 1, it's multiplying 1 times negative 9.8, which means it's normal. But if you keep your eyes on here, we turn gravity down to 0, and all the gravity disappears. That's really cool to me. And next, I want to be able to steer a little bit, and so let's add a couple more properties here. We're going to go back down under here, add, let's see, 2 more. The first one, I'm more of a camera guy than an aviation guy, and so I'll just call this pan and tilt. The default value is 0, and the minimum is -1. Actually, let's have this be -100 and 100, and we'll just set the soft limits to -1 and 1. Okay, we'll do the same with the other property. This one will be tilt. Default value 0, -100, 100, and -1, 1. Okay. And ideally now if I hover over these and hit backspace, they both go to 0. That's good. And now we just get to start putting all these different forces all over our ship. You can be as granular as you want. You can actually, model the ship and map out exactly where the forces are going. I don't really care, so I'm just going to hide mine up ahead a little bit and have it pointing to the right. And I want the controls to be somewhat intuitive. So if we select the object here, you can see if I click on the pan value and drag it to the right, the numbers get higher. And if I drag it to the left, the numbers get lower. I want the ship to also go to the right when I drag my mouse to the right and all that, so that it's easy. So as the pan gets higher, I want this force field to get higher. Probably goes without saying. So I'm going to select this constraint, which, because I just duplicated, the other thrust constraint already has a driver set up. I'm going to right click on this edit driver, and instead of thrust, I'm going to change this to pan. And we'll change the name of the variable too, just for fun. Pan times 70. I don't know what we want to multiply it by yet, but let's give it a shot. Let's try playing it. If we hit play here and I turn up pan, look at that. It's behaving exactly how I'd want. That's pretty fun. Maybe I'll move it back so it's just kind of like just in line with the front of the ship there. But right now the ship can only rotate in one direction, and that's because here, if we drag it to the left, nothing happens, and that's because the constraint impulse can't go below 0. It can only go up. That is a very, very easy thing to fix. I'm going to duplicate this, rotate it 180 degrees, and under its driver, I'm going to right click, edit driver. I just got to make one of these numbers negative. Here, -70 now. So now when you drag it to the left, -1 times -70 equals +70 for this one. And it goes the other way. I hope I didn't lose it. This is simultaneously like really basic stuff, but also kind of like in a context where it's just words and numbers, and I don't want people's brains to kind of turn off because it actually is not complicated at all. Here, now that we've got these kind of set up, let's duplicate, rotate them to be the other axis here. And all we got to do is edit those drivers to be tilt instead. And we'll do the other one, remembering that this one is -70. And in theory now, if we hit play, first our scene is only 250 frames long, which means it'll always reset. I'm going to crank that number up to be longer, and also the rigid body scene has a 250 frame cache, which means it would stop animating after that too. So I'm just going to crank both of these so we can play around with it a little bit longer. But yeah, now we can select this cube, we'll turn up the thrust, let's have it pan to the left here, we can have it tilt up, and all the physics are just playing nice. Look at that, it's floating through the void. One thing we can do if we want to is we can introduce a little bit of drag. And I know I was already saying you shouldn't use force fields with rigid body objects, but until anything goes horrifically wrong, I'm going to think it's kind of okay in this case. Shift A, force field, drag, and let's see how that plays just right off the bat. Gonna zero all of these out. If we turn up thrust, it's going much slower. So let's try changing the drag to be like 0.1 instead. Or maybe even like 0.05. And this means now we're not operating in a perfect vacuum, but if I turn off the thrust, the ship will kind of deaccelerate to a stop in a way that maybe makes it a little bit easier to animate. And of course, we can actually control the drag from inside the ship itself as we're piloting everything. I think I'll probably never want to go higher than like 0.1 for the drag. Here, let's add a new property. New drag. The default is 0, and it goes from 0 to 1. Okay. Then we'll click on the constraint. We'll right click on our drag input here, add driver. It's also going to come from the spaceship. Oh, and it's going to be a single property here. And we're just going to type in, quote, drag. And the drag input goes from 0 to 1, but because I never really want drag higher than like 0.1, I can just go in here and, oh yeah, we'll call this drag too. And we'll say, hey, it's whatever value drag is times 0.1. Or maybe 0.2. Yeah. I like things to feel like they're doing something when I change the slider, you know? So we've got our thrust. We turn off the thrust. We're now floating in a vacuum. And if we turn up the drag, the ship slows way down. Okay, that's pretty cool. And I think you can tell my brain is probably fading a little bit for the night. So I'm going to say that's good for now. Hopefully, I can pick this up with the same mental wherewithal on another night, because this is where the stuff actually starts to get fun. We've done all the basics, now we get to smash it into stuff and have it pulling well, you'll see. Hello, and it's the next day. Today went pretty good, except at one point a guy stuck his hand out towards me kind of like this. I didn't know if I was supposed to like clasp it or like high-five it, and I think I picked the wrong one. But yeah, now we get to play around with all the fun stuff. We did all of the hard work. Here, I'm gonna add twice as many asteroids here, because at this point you get it, all of it. We've covered everything. All right, so we got these. I'm going to add a camera to the top of our spaceship, so we kind of get a first-person view here. I'll kind of stick it in the back, maybe widen up the field of view. And let's add a little bit of camera shakeify too, just because that'll make it feel more alive. So if we, we'll raise the camera maybe a little bit here. If we select this, we get our controls, hit play. Let's turn up the thrust. I didn't parent the camera to the cube, but here, let's see if we can crash it into some stuff. Yeah, look at that. And here we'll straighten out a little bit. Oh, this is great. And we'll tilt down. Hit that one. Yeah, and it flies off into the distance. Excellent. Something else I think would be fun is to kind of set up like a bunch of cargo, because I think that would just be some fun physics in kind of a zero gravity situation. So let's create a cube here, scale it up, Control A, apply the scale. Let's add another one here and another one. And we could use a lot of different constraints here. It could be interesting to use kind of a general constraint with like a little bit of spring to it so everything bounces. But first, let's just do our usual point constraint here. So select F3, add active, and then F3 connect. And location will be active, the type will be point, and we'll select chain by distance, which hopefully means, yeah, each one is just parented this, the next one. And so here, we'll do this one from this point of view so we can actually see it. If we turn on the, oh, I still have the pan going. But look at that, it's actually pulling everything. And that looks a little bit weird here. We'll turn the panning down, we'll turn up the thrust. Although also, we could set up a hitch just right on the back of this front cube here. In fact, let's do that. I'm just gonna duplicate this, scale it down here, and apply that scale. Let's turn the weight up for all of these too. Now, if you have a lot of objects with the same settings selected, we can do something like hit 10, and if I hold down Alt, it's going to update all of them at the same time. So Alt, Enter, and when we check all of these, they should all be 10 kilograms all with that. So now, let's see, I'm going to connect these real fast with fixed, which means they'll just be attached to the back here, and I'm going to connect these to that one using point, which means they'll have, be rotating around that point. Active, chain by distance, which means now this will hopefully be, if we zero all of these out, a little bit more intuitive here. Let's find out. Turn up the thrust. We're going forwards. Ooh, it's going a lot slower now because we've got all the weight from that stuff here. If we try to go to the right. Oh, that's kind of cool. Yeah, so you just feel, again, it's all just kind of doing things um, that I would have a lot of trouble animating. That's really cool. Let's see, can we turn the thrust way up? Let's see what happens. So you can see this is transferring energy into the weighted cubes, which is then trying to transfer them back, and now we're in an uncontrolled spin. We'll turn this down, we'll turn the drag up to like maybe 0.5, slow down a little bit, turn up the thrust, and let's see if we can get back up to these other asteroids. Anyways, we totally could. And you've been working hard at those computers. Here's a little nature break. This one was decapitated. Oh! Let's see if we can set up little thrusters on here. Apply the scale, and what I want to do is I want to use the thrust property to control the scale of this on the y-axis here. Okay, so just let's see, right click, add driver. We'll use the property of the spaceship, and it will be open bracket, quote, thrust, quote, close. And I think, let's see, we'll just do variable times 2. If I bring this down here also, and parent all of this to the main cube, Control P. If I turn thrust all the way down, hit play, and I turn up the thrust, we get a little hinges going. Turn it back off, and it slows back down. This is cool. Again, this is one of those things I've wanted to see kind of work for literally like 20 years. So this is, oh, that's right. These aren't rigid body objects. They're just parented on there, so they're not going to hit the asteroid. We could probably turn them into, let's see, F3, active. It might intersect with this cube and explode. Yes, it does, because they're not even connected. Actually, I'm just going to join them into this cube. And as long as we have convex hull set up, I think it should still work out okay. Oh, here, let's zero these out a little bit and go forwards. Let's see if we can hit that cube right there. So pan a little bit. We're going to tilt a little bit. Here we come, cube. Cool. And let's say we have a simulation that we like. Right now, if we start to play with this, we're going to lose that entire cache. We're going to lose the simulation. But if we go into the scene settings, rigid body, and say current cache to bake, it's going to lock that in until we click delete bake, which means now we can scrub around and everything is just in there, and we can't easily just lose it all. That's rad. Okay, what else could we do? I'm going to delete all of this cargo real fast. And there's a lot of stuff I'd love to do with this. Like, you could use motors to have different things happen on the ship. Like, the wings could extend outwards. You could even put the thrust on the outside of the wings, which would give them more, I think, leverage for it spinning. I don't know. But you know when Apollo rockets take off from the launch tower back in the day, and the arm would be like, and kind of detach? I want to do something kind of like that. So let's create... this won't be good, but you could imagine it could be good. We'll scale this. Apply the scale, F3, add passive, and I think if I connect this to this, F3, connect via a point constraint, which just means it won't be able to get any further away from this. Here's our constraint, so I'm going to move it to where I want it to attach to the tower right here. And you'll see under this constraint, well, first I'll just show you. If we hit play right now and turn the thrust up, it's not going anywhere at all. We might be able to pan, and you can see it's like stuck to the tower, but it's as if it's on the end of a stiff cable. But if we select this constraint, right here you can see there's a checkbox called breakable, and underneath that there's a threshold for how much power you need to break it, which means if we set that to 0 and then check the breakable box, the ship will be released. Let's turn the thrust, yeah, all the way up here. And I think it's as easy as if we select the spaceship here, we're going to add a new property and call it launch, I guess. Sure. And the type we'll set to Boolean. A Boolean just kind of means true or false, either or. The reason the Boolean modifier is called that is because it's like either it's intersecting or it isn't, I think. But yeah, that should just give us kind of a checkbox here. Okay. And look at that. There we go. Launch or not launch. Can you shuffle these around, or are they always in alphabetical order? I don't know. And let's do this one the easy way. Right-click, copy as new driver. We click on our constraint here and just paste driver right into that checkbox. And if we turn up the thrust, nothing happens here. We'll have it pan that way. But when we check the launch box, there it goes. It's flying off into space. Ooh, before I go, here, let's go into rendered mode here. I'm gonna hide the ground. Let's add some color to the thruster using drivers and all that too. I'm gonna give it a new material here. We'll call it the flames. I'm gonna slide open the shader editor, and I'm going to set up an emissive shader here, drag that right into the surface, and give it a strength of maybe 15. But we'll have the power of the thrust control the color here. So I'm going to create an input with a value, and that value is just going to be whatever the thrust of the ship is, which we can get really easily now with the easy way. I'm going to right-click here, copy as new driver, go back into the shader editor for the flame, and right-click, paste driver, drag that into the color here. It means now when the thrust is 0, the emission is 0, and it goes up to 1. We can remap this too. We can put this value through a color ramp here, which instead of going from black to white, let's make it be like maybe a dull blue to like a brighter blue to maybe like nice fire. Yeah. And here we'll turn the strength back down to like 2 or something. But now, hopefully, we turn the thrust down. It gets kind of a dull blue. And as the thrust increases, it gets all the way to orange. That's pretty rad. So we'll hit play. We'll check the launch button. Turn up the thrust. That's really fun. Okay. The fun part, of course, is then parenting actual spaceship models to all of this. So it's not just a bunch of gray cubes. But maybe we'll do that in a later video. Come on. I want to go faster. Let's hit one of these cubes again. Yeah. Oh yeah, and sometimes the cubes will just get stuck. And if they do, just go down under surface response and turn down the friction. Because the friction's up so high, things kind of have a tendency to stick together a little bit more than maybe makes sense. But I'll upload this file if you want to use it for anything or play with it. And yeah, I don't know. Hopefully this is interesting to somebody. I think I'm going to be using this type of thing a lot for animating the spaceship, and it'll be fun to kind of come up with variations for trying to have it fly in actual gravity and all that. But until then, I'm just happy to have finished recording a video. It's been so tricky. But I think this has kind of broken the ice, so hopefully I'll be seeing you very soon. And again, excited to tell you what I've been up to. It's been crazy. But yeah, I'm gonna see if I can get this edited. So, hope you're doing well. I'll talk to you soon. Goodbye.